Good morning, everyone. We're going to start in just a few moments. Good morning, everyone. If you'd like to go ahead and put your organization name and country in the chat, we can see where everyone is joining us from today. Good morning, everyone. We'll begin in a few moments. Excellent. So go ahead and throw your organization and country name in the chat so we can see where you're joining us from. It's wonderful to see everyone all over Malawi, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Mozambique. Excellent. My name is Susan Melnick, and I'm the Strategic Communications Manager here at ASAP2. And we'll get started in just a couple of moments. We're going to wait for a few more people to join us. Excellent. And if you're just joining us, go ahead and throw your organization and country in the chat so we can see where you're tuning in from. Wonderful. Excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started as people are joining us today. So again, my name is Susan Melnick, and I'm the Strategic Communications Manager here at the ASAP2 project. ASAP stands for Accelerating Support to Advanced Local Partners, and we are a USAID PEPFAR capacity building mechanism. And we put on these weekly webinars. We have for a number of years, and I know many of you have joined us because I recognize many of these names in the attendee list today. So thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar is Building Highly Effective Boards, and we have an excellent presenter here with us. She just recently presented at the USAID Global Health Local Partner Meeting, and we're really excited to be able to bring this training to you all. Petronella is a fantastic speaker, and I think you'll really enjoy today's workshop. And we're going to have a few things today that we're going to do. And the first one is a quick poll. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. This poll is a couple of quick questions that USAID had for all of our participants. And it should pop up on your screen. So you can go ahead and we'll just take a moment now. A couple of the questions are about the UEI, which is the Unique Entity Identifier. It's part of the SAM.gov registration. It replaced the DUNS number. And we know that we've heard from many of our local partners that there has been some issues with getting the new number. So USAID would like to just sort of take a little temperature and see where we're at there. We do have some additional resources that we can share about the UEI, and we've also included it in the newsletter that we sent out last week. And then we had a couple of questions about what additional webinar topics you might like to see. So go ahead and feel free to add them both to this poll, but also to the chat throughout today's webinar, and I'll make sure to copy them down and we'll share them with USAID. Excellent. So I'm going to let that run just for about 30 seconds more. Next slide, please. Sorry, Petronella, are you having an issue with the slide? You'll have to come off mute.
Hi, Susan. The slides are not, they're frozen on that screen. Sorry.
No worries. And I can always share if we need to. All right. So still frozen. Should I go ahead and share screen?
Yes, please.
Okay, not a problem. Let me see here. Sorry, everyone, just give us 1 second. It wouldn't be live TV if we didn't have a little bit of an internet issue. So hold on 1 second. All right. Okay, here we go. Can everybody see my screen?
That's right.
Perfect.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. All right, so not a problem. I'm going to go ahead and just take a look at how that poll is going. Great. I'm going to leave it up for a couple minutes and then I'll go ahead and take it on. All right. So we have a couple of things to mention today. I know many of you have attended past ASAP webinars, and so you already know this, but if you're new to our webinar today, please go ahead and let us know where you're from. Put your country and organization in the chat, and it gives us an idea of where you're joining us from. We're going to use the Q&A box. So there's a box at the bottom of your screen, and that is what we use for all of our questions. So certainly feel free to interact with one another and with those of us here in the chat. If you'd like to say hello, or if you have any specific sort of note or an answer to somebody's question. But if you have a specific question, we use the Q&A box, bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and pop it up and you can type your question in there. And Petronella is going to be answering questions throughout the webinar today. So we'll be sure to get to it. If we don't get to everybody's questions, then Petronella will be wonderful enough to answer some of those in writing, and we'll provide the information after the webinar. Oops. We do have 2 polls, so the first one is already up and going, but the next one will be at the end of the webinar today, and it's just a quick feedback poll, and we really appreciate your input. And as a reminder, we're going to be posting this presentation. It'll be on ASAP's website, and I'll share the link in the chat in a few minutes, and again at the end of the webinar, so you have it. And it will include both the presentation and the recording of this webinar. As a reminder, ASAP has done a number of webinars. This is, I believe, our 76th one. I'll have to double check, but we have had many wonderful attendees like yourself, and we really appreciate you being here today. Feel free to share both the newsletter and the webinar once the recording is out with any of your colleagues or your subs on your USAID projects, because we are happy to capacity build beyond our current partners. And many of our webinars are also available in 3 different languages. So today we are holding it in English. This webinar will be held in French in February, and we will provide that date very soon. And we are hoping to hold it in Portuguese as well at a later date. And you can search on the ASAP website any of the languages to see all of the webinars that are held in different languages. And just as a reminder, we will be sharing the slide deck and the recording. So that will be shared after the webinar, and I will provide you the link to those pages as soon as we are going today. And we do have a wonderful upcoming webinar. So another presenter at USAID's Global Health Local Partner Meeting will be here on January 26th, and Rebecca will be presenting business development. And it was a wonderful training session at the local partner meeting, so we're really excited to share that with you as well. And now it is my great honor to introduce to you Petronella Mwasandubi. She is an ASAP2 Leadership and Governance Capacity Advisor and a decorated nurse with her MBA, and also the author, because she hasn't done enough already, the author of the USAID ASAP Board Leadership and Governance Manual. So I'm really excited to introduce to you Petronella, and again, she'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. So please use the Q&A box, and let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Petronella.
Thank you very much, Susan. Welcome everybody to this session on building highly effective boards. I always think that leadership and governance is one of those exciting areas, in particular with the work that we do and how much of a difference that we make with organizations, with communities. So welcome, and I hope to be engaging with yourselves. I don't want to be talking to you a lot, but let's have a dialogue as we go. So the objectives of this workshop it's really to share some of the big themes on factors that create and sustain high-performing board leadership. And what do I mean about this? It's also about creating a safe space to reflect on our own practices and perspectives as leadership of teams. I'm hoping that, you know, as we go on, there'll be some dialogue around that. But also for you, some of you may be to build on some of the skills that you already have. So acquire some new board leadership frameworks and tools to use. I will certainly just be sharing some of those, and also about identifying personal and collective board leadership actions that you may want to take. Next slide, please. So what is board governance? It's about the leadership of decision-making, culture, you note I've put that in bold, controls, and accountability from the boardroom and throughout the organization. It's all about achieving consistently great outcomes. In reality, governance, for me, is about happy, capable people delivering great outcomes and making the world a better place. It's what I say, the other statement I tend to use quite a lot is about having the right people in the right place with the right thinking, having the right dialogue to make, you know, the right choices and decisions for the people that we work with. Next slide, please. And the purpose of a board, of course, is to provide confident and strong strategic leadership, which leads to robust, again, accountability, oversight, and assurance for excellent organizational and financial performance. I think when we look at this slide, usually confident, strong, and robust are pretty clear. But one of the things why I really have put in bold is assurance. So when you have a board, when you have a team working with the executive director in the organization, what is it that they are doing to assure the board that everything is going as it should, that money is being spent well, and that the organization has got its strategic plan being delivered as it should. Next slide, please. And there are many, many models of thinking about effective and high, you know, guiding high-performing boards. I will be talking to some of this, but just some examples. You know, we've got the Deloitte governance framework, where you look at, the overall governance. But why I like this is there's risk and culture right in the center of where, it should be in each of the organizations. There are other frameworks that look at best practices, and then also looking at board, behavioral dynamics and frameworks for dashboards. So all these also help us to build on where we're at. And I think I'm going to be sharing some of these, but I also like you to think of this slide as, once you go back in your own workplaces, it's about thinking about what other things can we tap into. So there are loads of models out there. Next slide, please. So the agenda this afternoon is very much looking at starting with our NUPAS assessments. I will be talking to why, some of the gaps that we have come to come across during our NUPAS assessments as ASAP. And then within that, you often come up with the board challenges. So I'm going to cover about board challenges, and then start to look at how we build effective board teams. How do we build a sense of belonging, creating a shared purpose? And of course, there's the whole issue of psychological safety. How do people feel that they can actually, talk about the good and bad without feeling that, they will be challenged on that? And I'm hoping that obviously this will also be about igniting energy for board change. And lastly, some reflection on commitments and action planning that each of you might like to think about and take away. Next slide, please. So during ASAP No Plus assessments, board governance is one of the key areas right at the top usually of the assessments reports. And in that, the assessments have covered areas of legal requirements. So is the organization compliant with regards to this board, legal requirements, licenses, and the laws of the country? And then, of course, is there presence of an organizational structure? What does that look like? Is there a constitution for the board or a board charter that talks about responsibilities, what is expected of the board, the numbers of people that you should be having there? So the assessments very much take a deep dive into this. And then, of course, a reflection on what is the emphasis on governance. So the control environment, are there adequate safeguards? I will be talking to this. This is where we look at perhaps finance management and board committees as some such examples that are there. And then, of course, ultimately the board part issue here is about organizational sustainability. Where is the organization at now? And where are they going? And what do we see? And that's very much what most of the our assessments have been very much about. Next slide, please. And of course, more of the governance areas, the board itself, constitution, as I've mentioned, but committees, so is there a finance committee chaired by a board member that will actually look at how the organization is doing? And then, of course, policies such as board member declaration of conflict of interest, which is pretty key. And as I will allude to later on, we often come across these challenges where there is a conflict of interest. And it's about us thinking, okay, how do we deal with that in a sensitive way that does not destroy the organization? Then there's the organogram again, but also the all-important board schedule with minutes of meetings, which is part of the evidence that actually the board is active. And then, of course, the strategic plan with a clear roadmap. That's one fundamental area. Where is the organization? What is its direction? What are the key goals for the organization? And how are they delivering on that? And also, moving on to the finance, which also talks to the strategic plan. It's very much about saying, okay, we've got a strategic plan, but have we got enough resources? So financial management is key, and we often take a deep dive into that. And also that leads into risk management. What are the key challenges? What are we likely to experience? And how are we going to mitigate those challenges? And of course, board and management, pretty key as well. Next slides, please. Of course, Susan has kindly mentioned in a nice way about this piece of work that I was really privileged to work on, and most of what I will be talking to is actually going to be available in the board leadership and governance training manual that we are soon to publish actually for ASAP. Within that tool, there are a lot of sections, there are a lot of tips, there are a lot of examples, and hopefully some of what I'll be talking to today will be in there, but to a greater extent. So it's also just to thank everybody who's actually helped me within this, in particular my advisor colleagues who has also been part of the journey. Next, please. Just the key questions to get us into this presentation. Just wondered whether, what are the board issues that you encounter in your nonprofit organizations or in your local implementing partners? Perhaps if we can have some answers in the chat, and Susan will be able to sort of maybe share that with us. Please.
Excellent. So we're getting some answers in. So one of them is commitment from all trustees.
Mhm.
So trying to get that buy-in. Sitting allowance is one of the comments. Lack of commitment. So availability and commitment is coming up quite a lot. The board not proactively supporting the organization. And the boundaries. What are the boundaries between management and the board? And I know you're going to go over some of those issues. That's definitely a big one that we hear quite regularly. Let's see, we're definitely hearing commitment of the board, considering that it's a voluntary basis. And the capacity of the board members, which is of course something you're going to touch on and a really important part of your consideration when you're bringing on new board members. Some people are saying fundraising and door opening, confusion about the management and board roles. Wow, we're getting a lot of great answers in here. This is fantastic. Succession planning is one of the ones, so that's a very interesting one. The founder being part of the board and also a CEO, so there's definitely an issue to discuss. Board remuneration, which I know we heard in our last webinar that we did last year, that was brought up as a topic. Assistance with fundraising, human resource management, and lack of commitment with the board. Segregation of duties, which again is that very important part. Let's see, and yes, the CEO is wanting to be involved in the board, how that relationship works. Yeah, a lot of great things. Someone specifically brought up founder syndrome, which I know you've talked about before, and I know you'll talk about a little bit today. So really good to hear that brought up as well, because we know it's an important issue. And undefined roles and micromanagement of the organization. So again, what are those roles for the board? And what is the difference between the board and the organization? How do they work together? This is fantastic.
Yeah,
excellent. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Yes, I'm sure most of these we're going to be touching on, and perhaps towards the end, people can pick up on some, during the question and answer sessions, should there be any clarification on that. I'm really excited because I think this just shows us that we're on the same page with regards to some of the issues that we also are finding out, some of the organizations, and my experience of working with various, nonprofits, very much the issue of commitment is one of those that is always been glaringly an issue that causes problems. So, okay, let's move on to the next slide. Yes, key highlights that I think most of you have touched on this now. It's about the people who set up the organization, that maintenance of disproportionate power. So they're not understanding their role as a board member, and indeed maybe the chairperson themselves, working with the executive director in the organization, and there's there's no clarity about who is supposed to do what. And then of course, presence of a token board. This is one of those where you have a board, but actually the board is not really active. It's just there on paper. Often you find with such board, my experience is very much about, the executive director probably in charge in deciding who sits on the board, but the board, they don't come to the meetings, or they change them if they don't like, the sound of the person. And then of course, the other issue is about centralization of power. So there's no delegation and management support, and that can really be a critical issue there. And then where you've got senior management struggling to find the right balance. And of course, that also affects the performance in the organization. And what I mean about this is you've got a senior management team who are now having to work with a board, and now not so clear how do they align themselves. This talks very much about alignment of the board with the executive team. And I will come back to that because I think it's a fundamental area there. And then, of course, the poor people participation also talks to, the issue of token boards where, the board is not really active, even though, you will get given names and they don't participate fully in that. they don't often attend meetings, or they miss meetings, or when they come internally into the organization, they're not really engaging at the board level to actually get to satisfy, themselves that actually things are happening as they should in the board. And then, of course, there are those organizations that are always running in permanent crisis mode. Of course, that totally, impacts the way they function, and the effectiveness of the board there. Next slide, please. And then, of course, if the board does not put purpose first, then you get this haphazard approach, which then will not help the organization itself. And I will be talking to what we can do about that. And then, of course, organizational direction is unclear. This is where I've been referring to the lack of clear direction. What is the roadmap of the organization? And some of the board issues, executive director having more power than the board. Again, that's an executive director who may be a founder member, very key, had this wonderful idea, started this wonderful organization. And honestly, can you imagine, it must be so hard then having to suddenly find that actually you need to have a board, but they don't understand actually the value addition of the board. And that's where the issue comes in, when the executive director tends then to want to wield a lot of power there. And I'm sure some of you will be able to share some of that with us. That also leads to one or two members of the board dominating the others. And therefore you just have, again, board members who just come in, attend meetings, but they're not participating. That is really not a good one, because a board should have consensus. They should be able to openly discuss issues that are good, but also having the hard discussions about what is not working, who is not working, what should be happening, so that there is that mutual respect. And then they come up with, suggestions of moving forwards. Wrong people at the board table is one of those areas that is very key and very common. Again, it talks to appointment of the wrong people, but also the people without the right skills, where you've just got someone who's been picked from the community because someone likes them, and then they're sitting on the board and they tend to struggle, and they're literally what I call swimming, because they're not so sure how to conduct themselves at the board, nor do they engage at high level discussions that we expect, issues that I will be talking to in a moment. And then, of course, the board not measuring what it does. This is a very common one. And I'm not so sure why we are still at the stage where you would have a board, but actually they never measure what they do. And yet they are managing the executive director and governing the organization. So this talks to how, the practice of each of the boards, how they should be evaluating their performance as well. Because of course, sometimes you may end up with the wrong chair or wrong board members. And the only way you're going to know that is by assessing themselves, to actually look at the board's chair's performance, how they run the board, how they relate with the executive director, and any performance management and any outcomes that are actually undesirable. That's got to be addressed during this time. And then, of course, this other one is about the meetings that do not add any value at all. This again is like a token meetings, really, where people will have 3 monthly meetings, but then there's no preparation in between those meetings. There's no liaison with the executive director and preparing the financial management reports, nor is there, a session with the executive director and some of the senior teams on program delivery that's bringing in resources into the organization, nor is there any discussion about the strategic plan. So it's things that actually do not matter at the board, and I will come back to that later. But also sometimes the organization might be really doing well. Yes, it might have some pain points, but actually there may not be any celebration of what is working. And therefore, the board tends to focus on just the negative. And that can actually be really horrible and can be an enthusiasm killer, as I call it. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the board culture problems. This one, I would urge you, if you're working with boards, you're about to appoint board members, it's important to focus on what, this area. Talked about the chair too dominant and influencing. Usually they influence, a lot on decisions. So there is no deliberation between the chair and the board members, and then maybe voting to actually then come up with the best option of whatever it is that you're discussing. And I'm sure there are examples of it. And that sort of example, the first one leads to the number 2, which is the contributions are stifled. That board culture where people seem to have already had a discussion prior to the meeting. They know what they want. They don't want to involve the others. And if the others try to jump in, they get ignored, or nobody takes any notice of that. Influence on decision-making is also another culture problem. And why that happens is either you've got the wrong chair and the chair is not, taking everyone's contribution into account, or the chair and the executive director may well have an agenda of their own. So it's really important to be aware of that. So you would have board members who feel dismissed, and then they may abandon their responsibilities. And one of the things that I certainly try to pick up when working with the boards is to understand how much of a participation is each board member having in the organization. Because those who feel dismissed and abandoned, they will not turn up. They will not be committed. And because they don't feel valued, so you're not using their expertise, they may well actually leave, or just come and just sit there and go away without contributing. No information sharing is another board culture problem that you really need to think about, and we will be coming back to that. And of course, I started to talk about the founder executive director problem, very common, because the power base usually stays with the executive director, and they may have a token board. And it's a sensitive one, this one, but it's about looking at ways of how we can address that. Because, as I say, we have to value them for setting up the organization. We must not thwart that, enthusiasm that they have, but also then get to work with them jointly, that joint up thinking about the benefits of why they should have a board. And we will be covering that much more in a moment. Next slide, please. So the characteristics of a bad governance board: a non-independent chair. So they have got their own biases. Most of the board directors may not be independent in what they're discussing or contributing or querying. And also a presence of considerable conflicts of interest. And this is key, and is one of the key things to be addressed by each organization, is having a conflict of interest policy, clarity, briefing people on that. Then there are those boards, and I've certainly come across a few of these, where it is obvious that most members are all friends, old school friends or pals, and therefore it's almost, meetings are almost like, let's get together, let's have a cup of tea, and then they disappear. But actually there's nothing substantive that comes out of that. And then, of course, if the board does not set performance management of the executive director, so there are no key performance indicators, then it's really not a good board, because you've got to be clear about what the executive director is doing in the organization. And then, of course, the board spends more time on operations, which they shouldn't, because operations, the role of operations is the executive director who runs the organization, than on strategic thinking. So it's about the board looking at high-level issues, and I will be delving into that a bit more. And then you also, the last one being the no agreement between the board and management on the organization's risk appetite. And by appetite, meaning that the organization really, one of the key fundamentals is to be aware of what are the risks the organization is facing, who is responsible for ensuring that they are being dealt with, and that they are being reported at the board level. We will be coming back to that. Next slide, please. There are two types of board teams, given what I've just been talking about. To me, there's the board number one mindset, which is engaging and positive. And I'm sure most of us, I like to think it's just not some, but most of us have come across that, because I don't want us to go away thinking that it's all bad news. I had to share those, but actually we have got some good boards out there. And within this, you get a clear leadership presence. And what do I mean by this? This is where you walk in the organization, or whether you're working remotely or otherwise, you sense that the leadership is there. There's somebody at the top. They understand their organization. They're open to, discussing where they're doing very well, but also looking at some of the other pain points, as I call them. That's my favorite word, meaning some of the challenges that they may be facing, but actually the presence is there and they know where they're going, which leads to number three, helps set the expectations and the roadmap up front. So there's clarity about the organization direction. And when we talk about direction, it's not just about that strategic plan that then, you develop it and then you put it on the shelf. It's about it's an active document that is being used. And this board has got clear focus and it's got demonstrable values of success, which is something that I think we all should be thinking about. A key question is, how are you actually measuring success of the organization? And then, of course, that board also provides advice. There is energy in the room, in the organization. Recently, I've visited, quite a few organizations, and the minute you walk there, you can feel the energy, and that they have the resources, and they are very careful about that, and there's inspiration. So that's board mindset number one. And then the other one, obviously, there's disinterest, dysfunctional. I talked about power dynamics, pretty much, present in the organization. Then also you often find the direction of the organization is a bit fuzzy. What are they really about? Is there clarity about the outcomes? What are their indicators? Where are they going? Are the senior management really confident about what they're there to do? And are they keeping an eye on always, usually in this one, they're not always keeping an eye on resources. So, it's the whole human, financial and other resources of the organization. And of course, their approaches do not fully reflect what the organization really needs. So just, looking at where it can be really good, but actually there are some mindsets where things do not often work. Next slide, please. So, and one of the things that, I always love to look, to talk about this slide in terms of, what is our board composition based on? Because I think when we as advisors and or, others work with our local implementing partners, it's about looking at maybe a framework for belonging. What is valued in the organization? Is it about sameness, where everybody's, supposed to behave in a certain way? And if you look at the bottom, I'm starting from the bottom, working up, exclusion. I do not belong. I'm not welcome. They may not say it, but it's a sense of that exclusion. And then also uniqueness is valued. I'm different. I'm uncomfortable. So there's differentiation. So it's low belongingness in the organization. And then when you're looking towards the right, the high belongingness, where there's a sense of that belonging, you should be looking at, assimilation. I can fit in. I have to be guarded though. So there's somebody who feels that they are part of the organization, but sometimes they may well, when you have that little knot in your stomach because you're not so sure whether you're able to talk about the good as well as the bad. But then when you have inclusiveness, it's which is what we're aiming for. It's about a sense of I belong. I can be myself. I can raise issues and not feel that I will be beaten up, but challenged about why I would raise that. So I think when we're starting to move on to look at different, areas that board effectiveness, belonging is really one of those. Next, please. Now, back to a question before I move to the next session. What are the things that make a great board? And I guess some of the things we've already covered, and we'll have kind of touched on that. Maybe can we hear from some people? What are the things that really, to you, make a great board?
Certainly. So people can put their answers in the chat if they're more comfortable doing that, but then you can also go ahead and raise your hand and we'll call on you to come off mute and you can provide your answer that way. So please go ahead and put your hand up if you would like to answer on mic. But in the meantime, I'll read to you the many answers that are coming in very quickly. All right, so some of the things that make a great board is diversity, the skill set, communication, which as a communications manager, I definitely agree with that one. And it is incredibly important. You can have all the right people there, but if they're not talking to each other well, or they're not speaking to the organization well, good leadership. Let's see, participation, clear roles and functions makes a great board, which is very true. Commitment, as we heard before, is both an issue and something that can make a board great. Transparency, accountability, and ownership, one of the answers. Inclusion and diversity coming up again. So diversity is very important and certainly brings together many perspectives. Clear roles, expectations, and communications. So we're hearing that one again. Board independence. So I know that's an important one as well, making sure that they're independent from the organization's leadership in order to provide oversight. Competency and availability. That's an important one, obviously, for a voluntary board. Understanding the purpose and vision, which that's a great answer. That's certainly important for all organizations and boards. Having diverse skills, clear tasks and strategies, independence from management and transparency, providing advocacy for the organization, very important. Accountability, an important one. Wow, there's a lot of answers coming in. This is a very engaged group. I am really excited. This is a wonderful group we have here today. Let's see, having the right people with the right interests at the institution or of the institution. So in the interest of the institution. Participation and understanding of the mission, which is very important. Leadership, active participation, financial oversight, and direction. So we're just getting a ton of amazing answers here, Petronella. So great question. That definitely got them engaged. They are awake. They are not just putting us on mute and letting us play. They're definitely involved. So we really appreciate it. So keep your answers coming in because this also allows us to get an idea of the areas where we could provide some additional capacity building or maybe some future webinars as well. So back over to you, Petronella.
Thank you, Susan. And I almost feel like we should finish the session now because I think most people have answered the questions here, but I'm going to be obviously talking a bit more on some of the salient points that have come up. I think what was really poignant for me is things like competency, And someone also mentioned complementary skills. And I think it also talks to that word I used earlier, alignment of the executive director and the board, and how do you kind of complement each other so that actually you make an impact and the organization grows and you do well and everybody's happy. And then there was, respect. And I don't know if you noted, Susan, but there was jokes as well. Yeah, it's about, if you noted at the beginning, I said it's about happy people on that board. So jokes, having that downtime where, the board and the executives and this, this staff on the, in the organization feeling that they can be. And again, it talks to that belonging. And then I also, saw that there was respect and integrity and board development support. So let's move to the next slide and see how that mirrors what's coming up. Yes, certainly. For me, for the board, it's about adding value by being lean, transparent, and ethical. So that whole, issue somebody mentioned there about integrity is really, really important. We want a board that's not too wieldy and big, but also that is actually able to be openly transparent. Like I said earlier, the good and the bad and the ugly, but it's about doing it in a nice way where you're, starting to think about what can we do to make things better. That focuses on tackling operational challenges. Apologies, there's a mistake there, but operational challenges, meaning that the board governs, the executive director runs the organization, but also you jointly work on operational issues, and you obviously have to look at how you deal with those. It does it in ways that complement the big picture vision of the organization and always seeks the best outcomes for stakeholders. And I use the word stakeholders here loosely. There's the internal stakeholders, because your team in the organization and the people you work with are also stakeholders, but also there's the stakeholders who could be part of your resource mobilization, your donors, your support outside that organization, but work with you. Next slide, please. So for me, when we start thinking about effective board and high-performing board, it starts with having a terrific board chair who sets the boardroom tone. So they're very much about setting the tone at the top. They've got integrity, which again you will find it will come back again. This word about honesty. They also are transparent. They're able, I don't know, I'm sure most of us in this webinar are people who have managed others or have been managed. And I'm sure some of us have worked, and I certainly have worked with that, manager, your lead, who's got integrity. And you might have done something really, really terrible, but the way they will deliver that to you, you walk out of there thinking that actually they think you're the best person. So it's that integrity, that honesty, but without beating you about. And that's what we expect the board chair to be in terms of working with the organizations, especially if we're bringing in board chairs who are going to work with some of our small organizations that are starting to grow. They need encouragement, but they also need support to actually thrive within the sector that they work in. So the chair who's got ability to influence others without dominating is pretty key. And that they also demonstrate personal strength. The strength actually to take that position in the organization and support and work and be available when they're needed. They set out a clear vision and they've got a passion for board work. Again, it talks to that issue I was talking about. The same person is going to tell you off, but they're so ambitious about what you do. They're interested in actually understanding what each section of the organization does. There's access to that senior management who is running programs, and that chair is very passionate about that work and will ask, what can we do to support you in your program work? So you want that terrific board chair. They should also have intellect and maybe some experience that they bring, not necessarily maybe about your program work, but it could be someone with some good financial background, or they've worked in large organizations, but they will also bring that ability to support you where you are at. And they've got decisiveness, so they don't keep you hanging around. They've got the ability to chair meetings. And by chairing meetings, I'm talking about meetings that are effective, where meetings are not too long and wieldy, but they're focused. You've got some agenda items that are there, people are ready to report, but also you're checking in on where you are at as a board. And also that they have coaching skills. Because if they've got experience, usually they're able to actually support some of your departments. And more importantly, this is one of my favorites, emotional intelligence. Because one of the things that I think, not necessarily just the board chair, but it starts at the top, should have emotional intelligence. That ability to be able to put themselves in your position in the organization and in the executive director position, take on board what they're saying, understand the reports, but also start to be a solution to some of the problems that they may have. But if it's done in an emotionally intelligent way, then it will not hurt anybody, but actually will bring in motivation, and people will want to be belonging in that organization. Next slide, please. Chair and leadership combined is even better. So I've talked about terrific board chair, but actually if there's that leadership and they're working well, creating that sense of belonging to themselves, but also so that everyone is being valued for their own unique and authentic selves, that chair is brilliant. It's also, the energy that they will exude in the organization will just make people feel the belonging, thrive, and so, people around them. And I'm sure some of us have got these organizations where you just walk in or you're working with them and you just feel the energy. And that's what we're talking about here. Next slide, please. It's about sharpening your governance. That's the next one. Bringing in quality board members, people with the right skills, and not just the right skills, but also their demeanor is right. So when you're starting to think about recruiting board members, it's so important that quality comes into it. Having the right conversations is really, really key. It's about selecting what it is that's relevant for the board. Remember, you've got your board charter, your constitution, and it's always important for the board to check in on that, because the right conversations have got to take place, and they've got to take place using the right thinking, focusing on the right issues and not interfering with the running of the organizations, and then making difficult decisions based on the best information. This is key. So any decisions, remember some of the dysfunctional boards I talked about earlier, they often just make a decision and they don't discuss, they don't allow. As I say, sometimes they've already decided on what they want to talk about and they've already decided on the outcome. But good governance boards, they always make decisions based on the best information. And that's your litmus test. If you're working with organizations, checking on this one is very important. It's also about having that challenging and supporting the executive director in the right way. Again, talks to my example of, working with the executive director and having that relationship where alignment is present, so much so that when you're challenging them and or supporting, it's done in a right way, which is mutual understanding and respect, but with emotional intelligence. So you don't hurt anybody, you don't take personal issues, but you're talking to the issues that are relevant to the board, to the governance, to the performance of the organization, to where you're going as an organization, and maybe to even discussing some of the pain points, i.e. we've got the wrong people in the organization, they're not delivering. What are we doing about that? and also letting go of inactive and inexperienced members, which is what I've just talked about. So it's no point having people, I sometimes use the word, where it's almost like it's wood. They're there, they're not really performing, but because maybe they've got an affiliation with one of the key top people, there, no one is doing anything about it. And that's where it talks to performance management, pretty key. So what do I mean by sharpening governance? It's about having the right people on the bus and getting those who are not right off the bus. This is reference to Jim Collins from Good to Great. So if our local partners want to be good and grow, surely you've got to be thinking about who is relevant in the organization with the right skills, the right demeanor, and actually they've got the passion for what you do. Next slide, please. And then there's the use of a board skills matrix. Certainly in my experience and my colleagues, some of my advisor colleagues, we often talk about this, whereby, because I'm leading on governance and leadership, but I'm working with our finance lead in the organization, and then there's someone who's got monitoring, evaluation, then we've got someone with human resources. But when we start looking at our boards and some of the members who they will be working with, say in committees, use of the board skills matrix is really important when you're recruiting boards, because you want to be able to have a diverse board, so which means the composition and what they bring is very important. Right board members with the right skill set, the tone, they set the tone and culture of the organization. So examples of this, having someone with financial skills, accounting skills, but also legal. One of my local partners are actually looking to bring in someone with legal skills, but human resources is pretty key. So you want a board that's representative, that will support you in some of the areas in your organization. And this board skills matrix, as you can see, looks at technical skills, experience. And then on the right there, you see you would be looking at director A, B, C, D. So you then hone in on some of those. And when you do that, and as you move down the table, there's all the relevant skills that I would certainly advise. I've talked about finance, but maybe the industry experience, of course, the industry that we work in. Governance experience, this is somebody who has worked in other boards, maybe in a bigger charitable organization, or maybe someone with risk management experience or operations. So you need to think about that as you're deciding who to bring in on the board. But then within that, include the capabilities. Are they able to assimilate and synthesize complex information? So when you bring information to them, are they able to understand that? Capacity to develop and deliver a logical argument. So during the board meetings, are they able to actually contribute and in a comprehensive or, in a coherent manner, so that people are able to actually deliberate on the issues that are being discussed? Are they innovative thinkers? We want some of those, because as we're moving on with our local partners, there's an issue about thinking big picture and where they're going in their direction. You might want a board member with that experience who will help you mobilize resources, who will have innovation about the next stage of your strategic plan and how you might move your organization. That's pretty key. And of course, leadership ability to understand management of people, maybe someone who is really into HR and some of the performance management, appraisal of people, so that, the organization ticks away on the big things, but also the people skills, the, culture in the organization. So as you can see, a board skills matrix is really important. A lot more things on this table, but at the bottom there, personal attributes, very key. What are they like as a person? Are they likely to engage and work as a team player? Do they sound enthusiastic? So what I'm edging on with this slide is about boards actually taking time to use a skills matrix, but taking time to interview their board members and not just pick someone without actually understanding who they are and what contribution they're bringing to the table. Next slide, please. And then once you've recruited them, one thing that you often come across, which is also another area that then results in dysfunction, is that sometimes board members are recruited, but the executive director and the senior management has not taken time to work with the board chair to actually develop an induction for those new members. So board members should have a role, job description and contact details of the board chair, because there needs to be that two-way dialogue happening. And the role description very much covers who is responsible for what, that each of the board members has got to, understands the board charter of the organization, understands the code of conduct, what is expected of them as board members, that they understand the constitution. It's a must know. They really, really should have that. So one of the key fundamentals is for our organizations to have these documents ready. And then this one often gets forgotten for some reason, but there should always be a board meeting schedule. Because what I've found sometimes is, in the dysfunctionality is that people tend to some organizations just tend to say, okay, we'll meet next week or, in 2 months, but they don't actually have a schedule. Ideally for me, at least 3-4 times would be, 3 times, maybe every quarter, but also with one main one where there might be a team building exercise, but there is a schedule. But also the schedule might want to look at the board reserved matters. And when we talk about board reserved matters, are those high level things I alluded to at the beginning, the strategy, the finances, do we have enough money to run the organization? And the risk management, risks that the organization may be facing. Those are fundamental things that should always be part of each of the board meeting schedules. And there should be reports by the designated senior management to ensure that they share that. And then the board can then have a discussion. And usually at those board meetings, the discussion is actually about the board now. Once the managers have presented, the board discusses, they may want to get the board, the presenter, the manager out while they have some secret discussions, and then they may vote. So board reserved matters are key. And if your boards are not performing and not having a schedule and really clear about what the meetings are, then that's really one of the areas that should be addressed. It's a pain point. And of course, when you recruit your board members, there's the issue of confidentiality, delegation of authority, and key policies that they need to know about within the organization. So what I would expect and what we do certainly is to ensure that each of the organization has got some folders, some place where they've got some of these fundamental policies, and that the new board members and some of the senior management, or if they're relevant to the rest of the organization, they should be shared. Discussion of risks that they are facing, I have to talk to that. And of course, again, policies, protocols, and procedures. Then your board member is ready to take on their role. Next slide, please. So, talked about recruitment of the board. I've talked about, the board chair. Let's now move to talk about the culture. What is board culture? And what are the things that make a board culture? And I think it's always important to think about that. I don't know, again, Susan, is this something we can do in terms of time-wise, or we can move on to the next slide? It's just something that I think is really important.
Certainly. So we could ask people to answer
Yeah,
in the chat.
please.
And if anyone would like to answer on mic through audio,
Oh,
you can go ahead and raise
that
your
would be good.
hand and we could take a couple of answers. But if you're not comfortable with that, please feel free to use the chat. It was very active earlier. So what are the things that make a great board culture? And what is board culture? So feel free
Exactly.
to answer either of those. What contributes to it? All right, we're starting to get some answers in. So the availability to meet, even at ad hoc periods. So obviously if something has come up with the organization, the ability to call those board members together. And that does play into the culture, because if you have a culture that's open to that and that people are willing to come together and meet, it's important. Board members liking each other, which is, it sounds simple, but it is obviously such an important part to work together. You have to have at least mutual respect and feel that you're coming together for the right reasons. So team building can make a great board culture. It's an important part of that. Coordination meetings can build into that culture and set up an open dialogue. Being responsive, that's a great one. Excellent.
Okay.
Oh, lots of answers coming in now.
Yes.
It's like a
Thank you.
waterfall. It just comes in so quickly. Excellent.
Yeah. So let's see. Yes, absolutely. I think most of those and more is very, very important. Can I have the next slide, please, Susan? That's really wonderful there. So I think a really great board culture is where the chair really leads in inspiring the board members, allows for relevant topics to be discussed by the board, determines the agenda prior to meeting and shares that, covers board strategic oversight areas. So again, they're not just talking about the minutiae, they're talking about the big picture issues, strategy, finance management, and ensures productive discussions are facilitated, and also allowing members to ask questions. So you don't want people deviating, you want the chair to really be, facilitating productive discussions, asking the questions, why do you say that? How can we, look at this, things that actually encourage and energizes the board. And then also allowing time to discuss and members to contribute is pretty key. And also chair then enables the board to actually do what they should be doing. Next, please. And so when I talk about culture, and you will find, on this diagram, culture of effective governance and leadership, culture is often in the middle. And I think if you remember one of my second slide I used about different models, you often find culture is pretty key. It's about leadership, decision-making and structure, people, work processes and systems. So the key characteristics here, vision and cohesive leadership team. So if the team in the organization are not getting on, sabotaging each other, they're not working as a team. And certainly, I'm sure some colleagues, if we had time, we would be able to talk about some teams who come as and when there's no structure in terms of, performance management, in terms of what they do, which also talks to the lack of, the clear roles and accountabilities for decisions. If the good culture, that is, the roles are clear, people understand accountability and what is expected of them, the structure supports the objectives of the organization or the board itself. Then when you talk about culture, organizational and individual talent necessary for success, and of course, performance measures and incentives aligned to objectives is really key. And then also we focus on the execution of the work processes, superior execution of programmatic work processes, effective and efficient support, processes and systems, and of course, that high performance value and behaviors. Those people you just know, they know what they're doing. And lastly, capacity to change, because with a good culture, it's not always doing what you've always done. It's about looking to actually develop, move on, and actually grow as people, as the organization, as the board. So very key and fundamental issues on this slide, really. Next slide, please. So board culture, it starts by asking difficult board questions. Again, I apologize, I keep talking about the right people, but is now you get the gist everywhere, at every level, at every section. You've got to have the right level people, the right people in the boardroom. And are we structuring our discussions and assignments to focus on the right issues and activities? Do the board committee members and executive leadership model the desired board culture? Do we as individual board members consider how we contribute to the culture of the organization? So it's about asking questions like that. And us as facilitators of some of our partners, it's about also encouraging that dialogue to happen. Next slide, please. And then it's about assessing where you are as a board, assessing the current capabilities. Have we got capable people? Assessing effectiveness of the board as a whole and individual, members. So as a board, how are we doing? What about as, I've got a yes coming up there. As a board, how are we doing? But also as individuals, how are they doing? Identifying the effectiveness of current local implementing partner governance program. Identifying potential improvement opportunities for each governance board, and facilitating more specific conversations with the board, with the committees and the executive directors. Healthy conversations that are not personal, but talking to the issues. When a board is able to diagnose culture, then the board can evaluate itself and place in, how it plays in board performance and consider whether there are elements of board culture that need to change. So that's what should be happening here. Next slide, please. Then you got to ask yourself, what is your board like? Because board cultures tend to be more heavily weighted in one of 4 main cultures. Are you an inquisitive board? One that values the exchange of ideas and exploration of, alternatives? Or is it a decisive board, which is focused on measurable results, driving a focused agenda, which is outcome-oriented decisions? And then collaborative, valuing consensus, checking in on others, and having a greater purpose. Remember the one where I was talking about belonging? Sometimes it's about that. Or is it a disciplined board that emphasizes consistency and prioritizes managing risks, prioritizing planning and adherence to protocols? So those 4 areas are really key, and it's about each of our boards really asking, what's our culture? What are we like? And almost holding, a mirror to themselves so that they understand who they are very much. Next slide, please. So effective boards, they continually question its own governance, has got a clear idea of their purpose and role in the organization, understands that good governance is in everyone's influence. It is the duty of board members to, 1, remain focused on broad strategic goals, 2, tackle day-to-day issues, and number 3, meet their responsibilities. That's what effective boards should be doing. Next, please. And then, of course, it's about knowing your organizational risks. I'm sorry I keep repeating it, but risks are really important. And I'm sure most of us, if we had time, we would be talking about, actually, this is fundamental. This is a make it or break it sometimes when it comes to the risks. So there are tools that, usually when I'm, conducting trainings, and we always encourage on this section of risk management, for instance, a heat map. Very simple. It shouldn't be complicated. In each of the organizations, does the board, understand the risks that they have? And then it's about obviously assigning them whether they are just, they're okay, we know of those and we're doing something about it. In the middle, amber, they are mediocre. So this is like a traffic light system. And then at the top there, if they're red, then you should really be thinking, what are we going to do about it? So there are such tools. And actually that section is also in the board training manual. And then also looking at how do you measure where you are? So examples like the capability maturity stages. Are we still at the beginning? Where is the organization is at? And usually it covers all sections. And I will come back to that in a moment in another slide, but always looking at the risks in terms of, where you're at and where you're going and how are we mitigating? Is there an assigned person who's dealing with the risks? And how are we reporting them at the board? Is the board, more importantly, aware of those risks? Next slide, please. So there we are, some questions that we should actually be thinking about to ensure that you achieve your management of risks. What could stop us from achieving our priorities? Because if you've got big, hairy risks, it's important to know that they may stop what you're doing, and maybe your stakeholders may not be happy about that. What could ruin our reputation? What about our financial position? What could put us out of our business, not business in a kind of private sector mode, but we're in the sector that we work in? And also what has happened in other governance failures that we can learn from. Sometimes it's good to tap in on what's happened to some of your previous local implementing partners, charities that have suddenly disappeared. Usually one of those key pain points is risk management. Next slide, please. And then, of course, board assurance. I mentioned that earlier on. How do you ensure that you've established that everything is okay in the organization? Remember, assurance beats reassurance. So the board should always assure itself that everything is ticking as it should in those areas we're talking about. And also reassurance is very much about reactively having concerns dispelled by someone else. Challenge is positive. So assurance, reassurance, and challenging in a positive way. Board members having the duty to ask the right questions and constructively challenging answers that they are given. Because it's very easy to be told that actually, no, we're dealing with it, when actually you may not actually have the evidence that it's actually happening. So that's really key. And board assurance is one area you should always be talking to the executive director and board members about. Are we establishing that everything is as it should be? Next slide, please. I talked initially about maturity matrix. One of the things, and certainly the work I'm just about to embark on, trying to work with our local partners, it's about actually them understanding as a board, but also in the organization, sometimes, using a matrix to understand where you're at, what level are you at. So for instance, on this, I won't read all of it, but board agenda and strategy at level 1, is it just very much oblivious? So what do they mean? Sustainability is not considered for inclusion in the board's agenda or strategy. So at level 0, the board does not even discuss, strategy. And then of course, as you move up to level 4, 5, they discuss these issues all the time. And then you move on to stakeholder relationships. It's actually a good document to check in on where you're at. So you would be looking at level 0. The stakeholder engagement only occurs to procure a benefit for the organization. But then next one is internally focused. But as you move on, it gets holistic, and it's also looking internally and externally. So examples of such maturity matrices, and I think there's an example in the manual, it's very important. Very easy documents. This one is slightly complicated, but I've also developed one that's really at a level of some of our local partners, where they can look at it and they can work in teams to assess where are you at as a board, and also maybe executive leadership. Next slide, please. And then strategic planning, I've been mentioning a lot as we go on to finish our session soon. It's about setting direction for the future, very key. We need a strategic plan that talks to the vision, mission, values, strategic objectives, looking at your focus areas, reviewing those and setting targets, very key. Next slide, please. And then the ultimate question that I was asked earlier on, what, the board and executive director relationship. It's on this slide. The board, led by the chairperson, defines expectations for the organization, develops strategy, grants power, verifies performance, ensures compliance with governing document, ensures accountability and compliance with laws and regulations, and of course, that all-important fiscal oversight. And then management, led by executive director, very different, takes directions from the board. Whereas by the way, the board defines expectations for the organization. So they communicate expectations, implements strategy and policies, responsible for the day-to-day management of operations, program implementations, and also reporting results to the board. So as you can see, it's very clear, and those two should be explained so people understand those. Next slide, please. Effective boards set up committees, because committees are an extension of the board. So that's really important. Finance committee, maybe an HR committee. Some people also are involved in the program delivery, depending on the enormity of that program. They assist with oversight responsibilities to prepare the board for decision-making. They have clear terms of references, usually chaired by a board member with expertise, and they deal with issues, as I've just mentioned there, including fundraising. Committee role is an advisory one. They don't make decisions. They have to take whatever they've discussed to the board, and then the board makes the decision as an entity. Next one, please. I'm just going to share this. Sometimes you need to ask yourself, as I say, I've been alluding to, you need to take a step back about where you're at as a board. And this is one good example, which I think will be shared on the slides anyway. And to ask, each of the organizations, the board should be asking themselves, are you a personality board or a people board, a performance board, or a policy board? And when you look at it, the features of a personality is driven by results. They've got an iconic leadership. They use passion to exert power, and often strong, task-oriented. But the people board is driven by relationships. They know each other. It's a family atmosphere. They use relationships to exert power, and highly creative and people-oriented chair and a CEO. Performance, very much about best practice, replicating tasks, using reason and measures of performance. The chair is often a peacemaker and consensus builder. And also policy, driven by rules, bureaucratic rules, and the chair is very analytical, that very hard going. I won't talk to all of that, but it's just sometimes working with the boards and also making sure that the board is aware what they're like. And as you go down that table, you will see that there's the benefits of each, personalities, there's nimble, risk-taking. The other one, people, there's usually consensus-driven, but also it's very difficult to set priorities. And then performance board is very much facts, benchmarks, results, but not as innovative as they can be. And then the policy-driven one, always conscious, resistant to change. So that's just one example of some of the tools that things we need to think about for the boards to be much more robust. Next one, please. I will not talk to this, but you will find is again the maturity model that also we really need to focus on getting you to assess where your board is at, and this will actually assist so that people know where they're at in the continuum of the growth of the organization. Next one, please. And then lastly, I mentioned the governance operating framework earlier on. And what that does is looking at the organization holistically here. As I said, culture and risk in the middle, but looking at all elements from governance strategy, performance, integrity, but also plan, which is the green is the board, but actually the blue is actually the executive director and the team. Planning, compliance, reporting, and making sure that actually they're looking at those two, holistically. Next slide, please. And of course, it's all at a high level focus, as I've mentioned before. Next slide, please. So what that model would do using that approach, it enables you as a board and executive leadership to have a focus. So such a tool would allow you to look at your areas separately, but jointly as well. And it supports you with the mechanisms by which you can explore governance is implemented in you, how governance is implemented in your organization. You will be able to explore inconsistencies, overlaps, and gaps. And I'll show you the questions in the next slide, please, Susan. So for instance, if you were to look at the governance areas, you would be working your way down at each step and asking yourselves in the organization, how can we improve from where we are? Is everything looking as it should? Whose responsibility is it? And who needs to be involved and act on it? So you're looking at and examining each of those areas I've talked to. And then you work your way up, now looking at the operations. Why are we doing this? And this will ensure that every tactic leads to improved performance. You then make a list of your key priority improvement areas and look at asking yourselves, what other areas do we need to include? Next slide, please. So I think with the questions, I probably won't read these again, but it repeats the same questions about where should you be spending your time and looking at your committees. Very important questions, very important to use. Next one, please. I'm conscious of the time, sorry. So, signs of a board executive leadership that works well. The composition is there and it works. Respect and trust among board members. A strong team spirit exists. Emotional intelligence, the quality of the relationship between the board, the members, and the senior leadership is a nice one. And the board is always cheering the executive director and the staff, and the board being an ally, not an enemy, of the executive director, being used as a sounding board as a trusted partner. Next one, please. Finally, and so because I'm conscious we're running out of time completely, fantastic board leaders result in fabulous teams. So again, I won't read all these, but it's about creating a shared vision. You're about challenging the status quo together, signing up, being present, valuing and embracing difference, being gender focused. The board should not just be one-sided, male, female, all mixed, helping everyone in the team to feel safe and innovate, communicate, they talk, they are kind to each other, they think the best of each other, they achieve win-win for all team members and are highly productive, the greater part of everybody really. Thank you. Next one. So takeaways. A board is a team and requires team players to work most effectively. Everyone needs to feel comfortable, engaged, challenged, and be able to disagree. Members should understand that a board is for leading, not for managing. The support they provide should be top level and strategic rather than operational. this, to stay strategic in a changing world, they should be committed to learning no matter their level of achievement. And everyone needs to be willing to reflect and assess themselves and also be honest about where they're at. Next slides, please. That's it, really. Sorry, I have probably taken much more time. Thank you so much. I hope that's been helpful.
Perfect. No, you've been great, Petronella. And we have about half an hour for Q&A, and we do have a number of questions. So I'll go ahead and start out. And I did just mention to everyone in the chat, we're going to read out the questions that are in the Q&A box currently. But if you have a question you'd like to ask through mic or audio, go ahead and raise your hand, and then we'll call on you when we get there. So here we go. So one of the questions that came up was about the tool to evaluate and measure the effectiveness of the board. What is that tool again? And can you explain a little bit more about it? And do we have it available in the leadership manual as well?
The tool for board evaluation is usually 4 different sections to it. There's the evaluation of the board chair by the board members. So each of your board members completes this questionnaire about the board chair. And likewise, the board chair also evaluates board members. And then the board members also evaluate the executive director, because remember, the executive director reports to the board via the board chair. I can't remember, but I don't think the evaluation forms are in the tool, in the training manual, but certainly something that I'm sure we'll be able to share as and when, Susan.
Excellent, sounds good. All right. Great question. So do organizations have the role to train their boards? Is it the organization's role to do so?
I think, yes, I would have thought yes, but advisedly, in that the organization, if the executive director is working very well with the board, then it's a mutual discussion. And then usually the executive director gets involved in actually helping set that up, because a lot of the board away sessions and all that, the executive and some of this team are there. Usually it's joint up thinking, joint up working between the board and the executives. And so the answer would be yes, they can be involved, but actually then it should be left to the board and the members to be, because we don't want the interference from the operation side, but there should be some joint planning, because then the other side needs to understand, the operation teams need to understand what's happening as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, great answer. So here's one that's fraught with some issues. Should the executive director, who's the founder of the organization, be a member of the board? And
that's one area, a pain point, as I call it. Some of the organizations, especially the founder organizations, the executive director tends to behave and act as if they are part of the board. But in actual fact, the board should be separate. Remember, the board governs, the executive director is running the organization. So therefore, the board oversees the running of the organization. So the executive director should not be making decisions at the board, but they can talk to issues as, if there are any fundamental operational issues, they should be discussed with the board chair in between meetings, because one of the good relationship between the board chair and the executive director is they shouldn't just meet at meetings. They should be a liaison. If there are any, so let's assume a common one that I've come across is whereby a member of staff has stolen some substantial amount of money, and therefore there's this issue that has come up. The executive director would investigate that, talk to the board chair, but the issue, if it's fundamental, the board has got to be allowed then to take on the issue without the executive director making decisions or voting. The board is the one that makes the decision of the so what after that. I hope it makes sense.
Definitely, absolutely. So related to that, we had a question about if the executive director isn't able to attend a board meeting that they've been asked to attend, can they delegate it to somebody else, such as a family member?
Oh, family member.
Mhm.
That's a tricky one, because in the organization, are we assuming then, sorry, I don't understand the question, but I would have thought a family as in the team in the organization. That's what I'm hoping they're referring
Oh,
to.
I think they specifically mean a family member of the executive director.
Oh, no, definitely not. That's a conflict of interest, and a policy should be in place, and that shouldn't be allowed. And this is where the executive directors should be told what are the boundaries, what is expected. And I would expect the board to understand who else is participating in the organization, and they should stop that. I would have thought that's a conflict.
Absolutely. And that's a great example of why it's so important to have policies in place and everyone review them and understand them, because you can help to prevent some issues like
Exactly.
that coming up. Absolutely. All right, let's see. Lots of great questions here. Let's see. This was one that came up a few times and asked in a few different ways. How do you discern like the right demeanor of the board candidates at the interview level? So when you're doing an interview for new board members, what are you looking for? What kind of questions are you asking? What are you trying to assess?
Oh, that's it. I like that one, because I like to think I've learned how to be good at reading people. I think it starts with your panel, who you're going to have at the panel. You're not just going to have the one board chair. So it's important to think about who can you tap into. If you may be an organization that's working with a prime, or, bring some people with the right skills to support you, whether it's internal or maybe, if there are any, stakeholders or affiliation, affiliates that you work with. I think I would advise that. But it's about having the right questions. So you want to look at their skills. You want to look at what they are as a person. I would include some emotional intelligence question on how they relate to people, but also have they even taken time to understand the organization? What do they know about the organization, the way they're coming to be part of the board? Because I would have thought if you've shortlisted and you're going to bring them in, it's important to actually understand what they understand about the organization, but also the area that the organization works at. So it's someone with initiative, any innovative thinker, someone who is also really keen, and also looking at it from people's skills perspective. What are they like as a partner? What sort of skills? Are they a people's person? Are they likely to sit there and just, are they introvert and extrovert? There's this example that I always use, the compass game, where we talk about north, south, east, west, and each of those is this someone who's going to come in and say, I want this, how, what, when, where, or is it someone who's much more looking big picture, but they're leaving everybody behind? You need to look at those areas as you recruit them. I hope that answers it.
Absolutely. So would you use some of the same questions that you'd use for interviewing potential employees and sort of getting a sense of how they'd approach leadership and cooperation?
Very much so, but how they would approach it from a high level. Because remember, we don't want them to interfere with the running, of the organization, or, directly going to an individual without going through the executive director. But most of those in terms of skills, but looking at it from a board level would be really important. There are some skill sets that we would expect from people in the organization as well as board members. So an example, you can't not include emotional intelligence, that's understanding. Are they going to be empathetic? Are they going to understand the pressures the executive directors at? And we want our board members to be people's person. Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the questions is, what is the role of the board with regards to the organizational chart or organogram? Do they have some control over the organogram? Does it need to be approved by the board? What is their role with the organizational chart?
I I think there is an element of a role in the organization with regards to the organogram, because that is the structure. If you remember one of my slides where I asked the board and the executive team have got to be asking themselves, does the structure fit where we're going and what we're doing? So there's an element of that high level discussion and reviewing, particularly if you have so many pain points, areas where delivery is not happening, or in a department like finance where things are not happening. I think it's important to be looking at the organogram from that aspect of the departments and or the individuals in those roles, but working with the executive director. Of course, they're the ones who performance manage those people, but we then talk to the outcomes of those departments to be discussed at the board. So organogram is really key. A board should be clear that the structure of that organization is fit for purpose.
Excellent. One of the questions is, does an organization need to have a board for optimal performance? Is it required? Is it really important? What is the role there?
I think in this day and age, I think there's an expectation that you need a board or an entity that has the autonomy to oversee what is happening. It's just that it's, especially with your stakeholders, because it's really important. If you are applying for resources, you're busy writing proposals and you want more resources to come in, your stakeholders will want to know that actually there is a board that will help. Because remember the responsibility of the board: oversight over financial management, oversight over the strategic direction of the organization. And so I think it's actually a prudent thing to have, and most organizations are run like that, depending, of course, obviously on the charities that you work with. But most that I know of, there's an expectation that a board will be there, including some of our smaller organizations whom we are now training to actually realize that, it helps them. It actually adds to the performance of the organization, and it's a good seller to our key stakeholders.
Absolutely. And definitely getting started with your board and really investing some time early on can really help to, affect the trajectory of an organization. So really crucial. We have so there's a lot of questions about like the executive director's role and sort of power over the board or relationship too. So one of them is, what power does the CEO or executive director have to dissolve a dysfunctional board? If the CEO does have the power to dissolve the board, how would they go about doing that? So could you speak to that a little bit?
I'm not sure that once you've got the board there, because normally you get them registered and, you've got an entity or a legal entity, your board members are there in your constitution, and therefore, it would be really hard for the executive director to suddenly say, I'm sacking the board, because you've got to follow the rules and, regulations and the guidance in the organizational documents, which is why we as governance and leadership advisors, we very much, one of our fundamentals from the NUPAS assessments is establishing whether you've got the right setup in terms of legal setup of the organization, the constitution, the board code of conduct. And that has then got to be followed. And that includes also the role of the executive director. I think that question is talking to the founder member problem, where and I've come across it where you suddenly hear, oh, we've got a board member, they shared the information. Then when we as advisors want to work with them, maybe suddenly the members are not there, or they don't like an enthusiastic member who is working according to the constitution. They may want to dissolve the board. But constitutionally, I think the organization, by the time you've set yourselves up, you should have systems, structures in place to follow your guidelines and the legal route of the organization. It might mean getting rid of the executive directors. And you do hear of organizations where the ED, who might have been a founder, has been, nicely told to to move on, because then if the organization is grown to such an extent, are they still relevant? And it's painful, but it's important to think about. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let's see. So we have quite a number of questions that are coming in. I am going to just launch the poll, the feedback poll. So we still have 15 minutes and we're going to get through as many questions as we can. Just a reminder to everyone that if we don't get to your question, Petronella is going to go ahead and answer them through a Word document that we'll then send out. So your question will get answered one way or another if we run out of time. But I am going to just now launch the feedback poll just so people have time to fill that out. And I'm going to take one more question through the Q&A, and then we'll take one live. We'll hear someone come off mic. So I'm thinking, David, I'm going to choose you first, if that's all right. So in just a moment, I will ask you to come off of mute in just a minute. So we'll answer one more in the Q&A, and then we'll go back and forth between the two.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, so this is a great question. So again, about the executive director, what is their role in recruitment of the board? So to ensure, neutrality, make sure there's no conflict of interest. What is their specific role in building that board?
Actually, the executive director does play a role in headhunting board members, but and that's why we are running board leadership and governance training. Usually the problem comes in when they've not been socialized to how the process works. So then they think they can appoint. But, their role is very much to assist the board to identify suitable individuals, potentially suitable individuals. But then you've got to have a recruitment process for the board, job description, person specification, at the end of the role description that will set out what sort of person people you're looking for, and then also they help with the recruitment. But ultimately, I would advise that it should be the board chair, if you've already got one already, or some of the members, to help you recruit, interview and bring them in. And this is where I think our executive directors also need to be innovative and tap in, depending on which area, the programs and, people like that who are senior, who can come also help them if they're still starting to build their organization, because it just helps them to bring the right level people who will be fit for the organization.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to take a question on audio. Let's see how this goes. Always technology likes to cause a few problems. So David, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now. I'm allowing you to talk, so you'll just go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question live. And if we aren't able to hear from David, then I think Kadjo, Kadjo, I apologize if I didn't pronounce it correctly, we'll hear from you. So I'm going to go ahead and let both speak, and we'll see which one we can hear from first. And if not, we'll go back to the Q&A box because we have quite a number of questions in there. But again, Petronella, let us know how you're doing. I know we were losing your voice there for just a touch because you have a bit of a cold, but we really appreciate your answering all the questions. So David, can you hear us? And I don't think we can hear David. Yeah, I can't hear David. Kadjo, can we hear you? Did you want to go ahead and ask your question? All right, well, while we're waiting to see if we can get one of them on, let's go ahead and ask another Q&A question. So this is a great one about subcommittees. Are they a must-have to have, especially if you're a newly registered organization with limited resources? Tell us a little bit about subcommittees. What are the ones that are most important to have, and are they crucial?
I think, yes, they are crucial. And I think they should be part of your overall framework of the organization. And if you're serious about having a fully functioning, effective board, then it's important to quickly, identify the key area, usually if it's a small one, maybe 2, 3 fundamental ones. Like we've got our smaller organizations who've got finance, because finance is always make it or break it areas for the organization. So just having a board member with that experience chairing and helping you look at your numbers, helping you look at some of the fundamental issues that might arise later, it's really important. And then that board member tabling with the executive director the issues on the board. So yes, I think it's really important for the organization to, and from the outset, think about having the board, but also utilizing. That's also you utilizing the presence of the board in the organization, because then members are not supposed to be going around talking to staff. Yeah, they can greet them and all that, but not interfering with the running of the organizations. But they can be involved through the committees. Could be HR, and especially when you've got HR issues, disciplinary, and or bringing in new senior management, board members play a role in that committee. So that's just some examples there.
Excellent. And let's try one more person. Nehemi, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to unmute. So if you'd like to ask your question live, feel free. If not, we'll return to the Q&A box. All right, I'll gear up another question because we do have a number. This one came up in our last webinar, Petronella, and I think it's an important question. The stipend for board member participation. What is allowed for that stipend? How does an organization, do they put that into their budget? How do they, sort of make sure that they have money put aside for that? Can you explain a little bit to us about it?
That's a tricky one, that one, and really depends on the people in the organization, but also the rules and regulations of that the organization works to. So I know, for instance, with USAID, I think there's some guidance around you wouldn't want to use the resources for some of the activities that may not be considered. I'm just saying as an example of that. But it's more about the organization and talking to their stakeholders, as well as ensuring that the stakeholders, as in the board, discuss that, and are these resources available? Because some of the organizations are still really in their infancy, and it depends also on the maturity of that organization and whether they can afford to do that. Normally, board members, that we work with are come in on a voluntary capacity, and that's where expectations is got to be managed right from the outset. They need to understand there is often support with travel, and indeed if they've got to go and say if they're attending programs way out of the office into traveling, then there is some support that is often available. So I think I would say it's also prudent for the executive director to be mindful of that, work closely with the board to ensure that at least they feel valued. And what does valuing the board members in your organization look like? So that dialogue needs to happen, but within the rules, regulations of what is expected of you as an organization. So be mindful of your stakeholders as well. So it's a yes and no, depending on the setup of the organization. I think it's not as a done deal as in the private sector, where there is always a good budget and board members gets an envelope at the end of each meeting. I think I've seen that, and I've sat on some of those. But when it comes to some of our organizations, we may well not be able to do that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I realize I probably should have explained a little bit about that before I launched into it. So for those who don't know, in some organizations, the board members do receive some sort of participatory payment, or sometimes it's just travel related, like to get to the meeting or for the time. Yeah. Exactly. So it's not a requirement, and not all organizations would do it. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of ways to appreciate your board members that aren't necessarily financial. Obviously, if they feel really driven to help as part of the mission and they feel valued, then that can go a long way as well. So, so that's a great question. Thank you for the great answer. Let's see. So we do have a number of questions. What key elements should we take into account to force change? So if you have a board currently, maybe it's not functioning quite as you would like, what are some of the steps that you could do to start and get some change moving within that board?
I would say fundamental is performance management of each of the board members. So by performance management, certainly I've developed some performance management tools whereby you can have, for the board as well as executive director, as well as the executive director doing that with their team. So it's that feedback mechanism on performance. The board chair very much playing the active role of making sure that those tools are available with the support of the executive director, but the executive director does not assess the board members, but they can discuss the issues, I guess. And then the board chair then should be, once those board members have been inducted and they're now working in, acting as members, there should be regular reviews of each one of the every now and then, just as you would do your own teams on their performance. How are they contributing? Are they attending meetings, or are they, the fit? There's the organizational fit. It could be the board members not fitting in with the rest of the team, in which case then that's an issue. Then you'd be talking initially remedial action. I don't expect them to be fired immediately unless if it's something that's really substantial. And then remedial action being reviewed, say 2-3 months, let's see, at the next board meeting, and then the chair making a decision with the rest of the board members to say, okay, we may let some people go. And that tends to happen quite a bit as well. So it's a process, and it should come in under performance management of the board members. Very key, yeah.
Excellent. And really important then to have that policy set up that you're going to assess members at regular intervals, and that way you have something to follow up on.
That's right.
Absolutely. Wonderful. All right, let's see. So we have about 5 minutes left. Are you okay to keep going?
Yes, I'm good.
Okay. I knew you would be, but just wanted to stop sharing screen, but we're going to keep on going here. All right, so let's see. So how do you navigate having the right skills mix of members on the board? So as you mentioned before, it's really important to have, obviously, some people with financial management skills, but what other skills are important to have on a board, and how do you get that mix? How do you seek those people out?
I think, yeah, it's about having expertise, which is like, resource management or program delivery people or finance, but also you need a mixture of just good community people. I've known, charities where of a lady or gentleman who's doing some good community work, who would also be ideal on the board, because they bring a different dynamic, which will contribute to the growth in terms of the knowledge that they have, just participating and assisting the executive director. So you're talking about people who are confident speakers, people with the skills to and get on with others. They've got that skills to impress, to motivate others. And they may well be the board member you want every now and then to go around with the board chair when they do their visits and just checking in on the organization and people, and supporting and getting them to be on, to sit on some of the, let's say, disciplinary sessions where they are the neutral person looking at what the executive director is doing in terms of wanting to sack this individual, but the board member, someone who's got that sort of experience would be good. Usually tap into some of your local entities, charities, not necessarily, because if you bring just people from corporates, then you're going to have a very different board. You want people who understand from the ground up some of the issues that people are facing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a tricky thing. You want to have like the right mix of people with all different skill sets. But that can be that's a tricky part of it, right? It's a constant sort of balance of getting the right people there and making sure that they feel comfortable talking to each other.
Exactly.
And
yeah, they're a team player.
Exactly. That's so important. Those soft skills are really crucial to a board because they're working so closely together. So during your presentation, you talked a little bit about the board needing to raise and focus on the right issues. Could you talk a little bit about what some of those right issues would be? What what is it that the board should be focused on? Obviously, high-level strategy, but what other things?
Yes, high-level strategy in that if we've got enough money to deliver on this strategy, are we likely to run into problems? That's pretty key. But also discussing on how the organization is doing on its, delivering. Is it delivering on its mandate? So are they actually just there and there's not actually any outcomes? So what are the performance outcomes in the organization? Because sometimes the board and the executives may need to tweak those. But also risks, because with risks, it depends what it is. I gave example of maybe someone has stolen some, resources. There's always accounting issues especially with some of our organizations programs where they're traveling out in the communities and then misappropriation of funds and and those level, discussions at the board, is it you're wanting to get rid of a senior manager executive issues being discussed at that level. I hope I'm not deviated there. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I was muted there. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we've hit the bottom of the hour. We've definitely got through a number of questions, but we do have about 22 still outstanding. Okay. So if you don't mind, Petronella, I know we always get lots of questions for your webinars because you're so engaging and people are really excited.
Thank you.
And it's so great to see how passionate our partners are about their boards and board management. So we're really excited to see that. As a reminder, we're going to share this webinar. And we'll share the recording and the presentation slides, and those will be online tomorrow on the ASAP website. I've included links in the chat, and we'll also send it out through our newsletter. And then the leadership manual is just being completed. So we may add a few more things after this great webinar. We definitely got some ideas. And so that will be ready by the end of the month, and we will also share that. So it'll be available to all of the local partners and those who are on this webinar today. So feel free to share it with colleagues and your subrecipients as well, because obviously building capacity, it's great if we're doing it throughout the pipeline of your organization and those you're working with. So I just wanted to thank Petronella again. Thank you so much. I know you had a touch of a cold. We couldn't even tell. You were absolutely amazing. And people have been very appreciative in the chat of all this great information.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. So we'll be sure, again, we're going to share everything, but I think we're also going to need to develop a few more of these webinars, because I think there's a lot of little parts that we can hone in on a little more. And it looks like people would be interested in that. So we're excited to do that. And again, we are a USAID PEPFAR capacity building mechanism. This is ASAP 2, and thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next week at the business development webinar that will be held on the 26th of January. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody.